What would you do if a whisper from a stranger was the knife that twisted in an old wound you've tried so hard to ignore? That mother was just paying for a cake. A simple act of love. But the cashier's warning made her blood run cold, reviving the humiliating pain from the day she heard her own daughter-in-law call her the old tenant in front of her friends. The two pains, one old and one new, merged together, crushing her heart. Her world seemed to stop spinning. It became hard to breathe. Unable to face her son, she fled into the darkness behind the store. Her heart shattered. When you know the truth will be a blade plunged straight into your son's vulnerable heart, could you be cruel enough to be the one to wield it? The whisper in the aisles. My name is Adeline Dubois. I am 68 years old. And right now, I am hiding behind a metal dumpster. The back of my sweater is pressed against cold brick. The smell of sour milk and rotten watermelon peels climbs into my nose. But I don't dare move. Across the parking lot, under the hazy glow of a street lamp, my only son, Marcus, sits in his car. He is waiting, patiently, for his mother. He doesn't know that his mother, a retired librarian who lived her whole life by the book, is now acting like a common thief. My old heart, the one the doctor tells me to keep steady, is hammering against my ribs. I'd heard strange things about my son, about his family. I didn't believe them, not until I had to watch with my own eyes. Just 15 minutes ago, I was a different woman. I was just Adeline, pushing a shopping cart down the bright, clean aisles of the fresh market. The squeak of the wheels on the polished floor was a familiar sound. I picked out a rotisserie chicken. Marcus loves rotisserie chicken. I chose a bundle of asparagus, the kind my daughter-in-law, Sienna, says is good for you. I always try. I always try to be the kind of mother-in-law who doesn't cause any trouble. I live alone, in the senior living apartment complex. Ever since my James passed, Marcus is all I have left. A smart software engineer, a good son. At least, he used to be. Love changes a man. I know that, but sometimes I wonder if it's changing my son into someone I no longer recognize. I remember a time, about a year ago, I'd stopped by their apartment unannounced. The door was unlocked. I heard Marcus on the phone in his office. I heard him laugh. A sound that used to warm me through and through, but then it turned cold. Asterisk, asterisk. He called me the old tenant in front of his friends. Asterisk, asterisk. Just a joke. I told myself that 100 times. But it was the kind of joke that plants a splinter in your heart. And it has stayed there ever since. I pushed my cart to the checkout line. The man behind the register looked up. It was Eli Washington, an old friend of my James. We hadn't seen each other since the funeral. Addie, he said, his voice a low rumble. Good to see you. We made small talk. About aching joints. About grandkids. Then, as I took out my bank card to pay, his hands paused over the scanner. Eli looked at me, and his eyes held a kind of sad hesitation. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Addie, listen, he paused. You raised a good boy in Marcus. Too good. Maybe, just make sure he's not giving his kindness away to folks who see it as a blank check. A blank check. The words just hung there, in the cold, conditioned air of the grocery store. It wasn't an accusation. It was a warning. A quiet warning that felt as heavy as lead. I didn't ask him what he meant. I just nodded, my hand trembling so much I almost dropped my card. I paid for my things, took my bag, and walked out the automatic doors. But instead of walking toward my son's car, something pulled my feet toward the back of the building, toward the shadows and these dumpsters. Because what Eli said, it gave a name to a fear I had been trying to bury for a long time, and I knew I couldn't pretend anymore. I had to know. I had to see for myself. The Instagram Mirage, hiding behind a dumpster. At my age, James would have had a good laugh about that. He'd have said, Addie, what in the world are you cooking up now? But James isn't here. And this feeling, it wasn't funny at all. It was cold. It was heavy. My fingers felt stiff as I pulled out my phone. The screen lit up my face in the darkness. I rarely used anything on it besides the phone calls and the weather app, but I knew about the other things. The things the young people live their lives on. I opened the little app with the picture of a camera. Instagram, The name itself felt foreign on my tongue. My thumb hovered over the search bar. I felt a pang of something ugly. Guilt. This was spying. This was something a nosy, meddling mother-in-law would do. This was not me. But Eli's words, asterisk, a blank check asterisk, they echoed in my head. With a deep breath that tasted like garbage, I typed in her name, Sienna Vance. Her profile was public. Of course it was. Sienna liked to be seen. The first picture showed her holding a glass of wine. The sun was setting over rolling hills, covered in grapevines. The caption read, "Times spontaneous Napa getaway. Sometimes you just have to treat yourself." Asterisk. The picture was 2 weeks old. I remembered that weekend. I remembered it because Marcus had called me. His voice full of apology. He'd said they couldn't make it for Sunday dinner. He'd said the car broke down. And they just didn't have the money for a mechanic right now. I told him not to worry. I ate my chicken alone. I kept scrolling. Another picture. Sienna. Posing in front of a mirror in a department store. She was holding up a new purse. A Michael Kors purse. The gold letters gleamed even on my little screen. Work hard. Spoil yourself. Asterisk, the caption said, followed by a little diamond emoji. That picture was from last month. The same week Marcus had asked me if he could borrow $200. He said Sienna had lost a freelance client and they were coming up short on the rent. He swore he'd pay me back on his next paycheck. I told him it was a gift. My thumb moved faster now. The warmth from the phone felt like a fever. A picture of 2 enormous steaks, sitting on a fancy plate next to asparagus spears. At Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. I knew that place. It was the kind of place you go for a big anniversary. The kind of place where one meal costs more than my groceries for 2 weeks. Marcus had never taken me there. The date on that picture? It was the same night he had called me. His voice tight with worry. He'd said Sienna's mother needed money for a prescription. An emergency prescription. Each picture was a nail. Each caption was a hammer. And with every scroll, another nail was driven into the coffin of my denial. I saw the trips. I saw the clothes. I saw the brunches with her friends. Glasses of mimosa raised in a toast. I saw a life that didn't just whisper of comfort. It shouted with luxury. And all I could hear in my head was my son's voice. Tired. Strained. Asterisk. Things are just really tight right now. Mom. Then I saw it. The final picture, the one that made the air leave my lungs. It was Sienna. Smiling. Her arm was linked through her father's. Leonard. They were standing in a driveway in front of a car. Not just any car. A BMW. It was brand new. A shiny, silver BMW that looked like it had been driven right out of a commercial. The big red bow was still on the hood. I looked at the date. The picture had been posted 2 days ago. 2 days ago. On Tuesday, Marcus had come over to my apartment. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He told me he had to drain his savings account. He said there was a family emergency. He said Leonard needed an urgent surgery, and the insurance wouldn't cover all of it. He'd sent them $2,000. He called it a loan, an urgent loan. I looked at Sienna's smiling face. I looked at Leonard, standing so proud next to that car. I looked at that big, red, celebratory bow. Alone. I turned off the phone. The screen went dark. The trembling in my hands was gone now. It was replaced by something else. A stillness. A cold, hard clarity that settled deep in my bones. The kind of quiet that comes right after a storm has passed, when all you can see is the wreckage. The price of silence. I smoothed down my sweater, took a quiet breath, and walked away from the dumpsters. My shadow stretched long in front of me as I crossed the parking lot. Each step felt heavy. I was walking back into a play where I knew the lines. But the meaning of the words had all changed. I opened the passenger door. Marcus looked up from his phone. A flicker of impatience in his eyes. There you are. Mom, everything okay? The lines must have been crazy. You know how it is on a Friday. I said. My voice sounded normal. It sounded like me. It was a small miracle. I settled into the seat, placing the grocery bag at my feet. The smell of the rotisserie chicken filled the car. It was warm. It was familiar. It felt like a lie. He put the car in drive and we pulled out onto the street. The silence in the car was thick. It wasn't a comfortable silence. It was a silence made of unasked questions. On the radio, A woman was singing a sad song about love. Marcus had his hands tight on the steering wheel. His knuckles were white. My mind was racing. How do I start? What do I say? The librarian in me wanted to lay out the fact. Exhibit A, the vacation. Exhibit B, the new car. But the mother in me was terrified. I decided to start small. A little pebble, tossed into a still pond, just to see the ripples. I cleared my throat. How's Sienna's marketing work going? Honey, I see things online that say it's a growing field. Marcus didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the road. The muscle in his jaw tightened. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat. Empty. It's the same. Mom. Up and down. You don't need to worry about it. Asterisk, you don't need to worry. Asterisk, he was building a wall. Right there. In the space between the two front seats. A wall made of polite, empty words. I knew I had to push. Just a little harder. I let a moment pass. Then I said, my voice as casual as I could make it. I just worry about you both. I know how hard you've been working. I hope Mr. Leonard's surgery went well. That was it. That was the stone that hit the bottom of the pond. The silence that followed was different. It was heavier, longer. I watched the houses pass by outside my window. A brick house with a neat lawn, a blue house with a bicycle on the porch. Each one was a little world of its own, with its own truths, its own secrets. Finally, Marcus spoke. His voice was sharp now, edgy, almost angry. It's handled. Mom, he said, clipping off the words. Okay, it's just handled. Handled. That one word. It wasn't the word a worried son-in-law would use. It wasn't the word a man would use to talk about his wife's father's health. It was a business word, a word you use to close a file, a word you use to dismiss a problem you don't want to think about anymore. And in that moment, the cold clarity I felt behind the dumpster turned into a different kind of cold. It was a cold that came from the inside, a deep, hollowing dread. The problem wasn't that my son didn't know. The problem, the terrible, sinking problem, was that he times did asterisk. He knew, or at least some part of him knew. He knew the stories didn't add up. He knew the numbers didn't make sense. He had seen the cracks in the foundation, and he had chosen, actively chosen, to look away. He was paying the price to keep the walls from falling down, and the price was silence. His silence. My first thought had been so simple. Asterisk, I have to save my son from her. Asterisk. But as I sat there in the passenger seat of his car, a much harder, much more painful question took its place. A question that felt like a betrayal to even think. Asterisk, how do I save my son from himself? Asterisk, I looked out the window, at the blur of houses passing by, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the car's air conditioning. It wasn't just about Sienna's lies anymore. It was about the truth my own son was refusing to see. Have you ever loved someone so much you were willing to let them live a lie, just to see them happy? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I could really use a friend right now. The dinner performance. The moment I stepped inside their apartment, I knew I had walked onto a stage. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. The kind of perfect you see in magazines, where no one actually lives. The floors gleamed. The air smelled of cinnamon and something floral. On the kitchen counter, a shiny silver Nespresso machine sat like a trophy. Next to it, a block of Wüsthof knives was arranged just so, their black handles all lined up in a row. Thrown casually over the back of a dining chair was a cashmere shawl, the color of cream. It looked soft, it looked expensive. My own apartment suddenly felt small in my memory, and old, and cluttered with a life that was actually lived. Sienna came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a crisp white apron. She smiled. A bright, welcoming performance. Adeline, I'm so glad you could make it. I hope you're hungry. She gave me a light hug. Her perfume was strong. It was the same one I'd seen in a department store window, the one that cost more than my electric bill. Marcus stood behind her, a shadow in his own home. He gave me a weak smile. He looked tired. He looked like a man playing a part he had forgotten the lines to. We sat down at the table. It was set for 3. With heavy linen napkins and wine glasses that sparkled under the recessed lighting. In the living room, a new television was mounted on the wall. It was huge, curved, a black, glossy eye staring into the room. I remembered Marcus telling me, just last Christmas, how much he'd love a TV like that. But he'd shaken his head and said, asterisk, maybe in a few years. Mom, we just can't swing it. And yet, here it was. Had a few years passed already? Had time sped up without me noticing? Or was I the only one living in a world where things had a price? Sienna poured the wine. It was a deep, rich red. I recognized the label from the fresh market. It was from the top shelf. The $80 shelf. She chattered as she poured, her voice light and airy. She talked about her week, how stressful it had been, how a big client had pulled out at the last minute. We're really having to tighten our belts for a while, she said with a sigh, looking at Marcus with loving concern. But we'll get through it. We always do. I watched my son. He just nodded, staring into his plate. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at me. He looked at nothing. The meal was delicious. Steak, cooked perfectly, roasted potatoes with rosemary, the asparagus I had brought. Every bite felt like a lie in my mouth. We ate. We listened to Sienna's stories about her difficult week. We listened to her talk about the importance of budgeting, and all I could see was that $80 bottle of wine, half empty between us. All I could see was that giant television, hanging on the wall like a silent witness. I decided to stop being a spectator. I picked up my wine glass. I swirled the red liquid, watching it cling to the sides. I took a small sip. Then, I looked at Sienna, and I smiled. A calm, polite smile. This wine is lovely, Sienna, I said, my voice even. It must have been a gift. It's wonderful to have generous friends. The air in the room changed. It was so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. For just a second, Sienna's smile faltered. Her eyes flickered. A tiny, almost invisible crack in the perfect performance. But she was a professional. She recovered instantly. She laughed. A little tinkling sound. Oh, you know, Adeline, she said, waving her hand dismissively. Just a little something I picked up on sale. On sale. That was the word. The magic word that explained everything. The new car. The Napa vacation. The designer purse. It was all on sale. But this time, I didn't look at her when she said it. I looked at my son. I watched Marcus. He heard the lie. He had to have heard it. He was a smart man. He knew you don't find wine like that in a bargain bin. He knew. I waited for him to say something. To correct her. To ask a question. To even just raise an eyebrow. I waited for him to look at me. To give me some sign that he was still in there. That the son I raised, the one who knew right from wrong, was still present at this table. He did nothing. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at his wife. He just picked up his Wusthof knife, leaned over his plate, and very carefully, very precisely, cut another piece of his steak, as if the most important thing in the world, at that very moment, was getting the perfect bite. And in that silence, in that simple act of cutting his food, I had my answer. He wasn't just a victim in this performance. He was part of the cast. He knew. And he had chosen the lie. He had chosen the silence. His silence was the price of his ticket to this show. And right there, sitting at their perfect table, I finally understood. My son wasn't just being lied to. He was complicit. The drive home was worse than the dinner. The silence in the car was a living thing. It was heavier than any argument. It filled up all the space between us, pushing the air out of my lungs. The streetlights passed by in long, blurry streaks. I watched my son's hands on the steering wheel. His knuckles were white. He was gripping it so hard. I thought it might crack. I could have stayed quiet. I could have gone back to my apartment, locked the door, and pretended I hadn't seen what I'd seen. Pretended I hadn't understood what his silence at the dinner table meant. I could have chosen the quiet life, but looking at the rigid set of his jaw, at the weariness in his shoulders, I knew the quiet would be a lie, and I was done with lies. I didn't turn to look at him. I just kept my eyes on the road ahead. Marcus. My voice sounded strange in the small space. Too loud, too clear. He didn't answer. He just kept driving. Marcus. How much did that bottle of wine cost? He flinched. Just a small, tight movement in his shoulders. But I saw it. Mom. Please, he said, his voice low and tight. It was just dinner. No, I said. My own voice didn't sound like mine anymore. It sounded like a stranger's, hard and brittle. It wasn't. It was a performance. And you bought a ticket. I finally turned to look at him. His face was a pale mask in the dashboard light. How much are you paying? Son, I asked. And the words felt like they were tearing something inside me. How much is this illusion of a happy life costing you? That's when it happened. He made a sharp, jerky turn. The tires screeched against the pavement. He pulled the car over to the side of the dark, empty street, slamming it into park. The engine kept running. Allo. Angry hum. He didn't yell. He didn't scream. He just broke. He dropped his head forward until his forehead rested on the steering wheel. His shoulders started to shake. At first, it was silent, just a tremor running through his body. Then I heard it, a sound I hadn't heard since he was a little boy who had fallen off his bicycle. A choked, ragged sob. It was the sound of a man who had been holding his breath for too long and had finally run out of air. I didn't move. I just sat there, in the humming silence of the car, and watched my son cry, watched my strong, smart, successful son fall apart right in front of me. Minutes passed. The only sound was the engine and his ragged breathing. Finally, he lifted his head. His face was wet. His eyes were red and lost. He wouldn't look at me. He stared out the windshield into the darkness. His voice, when it came out, was a whisper, a shredded whisper full of shame. I don't know what to do. Mom. He took a shaky breath. I know. Okay, I know she lies. The words hung in the air. The truth. Finally. I see the packages arrive from stores I know we can't afford. I see the bank statements. I see the numbers that don't add up. He swallowed hard. But if I say something, if I push, she'll leave. His voice cracked on the last word. He finally turned to look at me. And what I saw in his eyes broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. It was pure, desperate fear. I can't be alone. Mom, he whispered. I just can't. I can't be alone. That was it. That was the price of the ticket. The cost of the performance. It wasn't about the money. Not really. It was about this raw, terrifying fear of being left. A fear so big. He was willing to build a life on a foundation of lies just to keep it at bay. I didn't say anything. There were no words for this. No, I told you so. No anger. All the fury I had felt earlier just evaporated. It dissolved into a deep, aching sorrow. I just reached my hand across the space between us. I laid it on his back, right between his shaking shoulders. The performance was over, and all that was left in the quiet car, on the side of a dark road, was the wreckage. The broken, beautiful, terrible truth. The long night. I didn't ask him to drive me home. I couldn't. You can't just put a bandage on a wound that deep and pretend it isn't there. The truth was out, bleeding all over the worn upholstery of his car. So I just said, keep driving. Marcus, find a place that's open. He found a diner, one of those old places that never closes, smelling of stale coffee and clean vinyl. We slid into a booth in the back. Under a light that hummed a low, tired song, the waitress came and went, leaving 2 mugs of black coffee that steamed in the quiet space between us. For a long time, we just sat there. I didn't push. I didn't pry. I just let the silence hold my son while he figured out how to piece his broken words together. And then, he began to talk. The story didn't come out in a flood. It came out in drips and drops. A memory here. A confession there. It started small. So small you could almost miss it. It started with Sienna just needing to borrow a few $100s for a car repair. He'd given it to her. Of course. Who wouldn't? Then there was a mix-up with her paycheck. Then a misunderstanding with her landlord. Each story came with a flurry of apologies and promises to pay him back. Each one sounded so reasonable at the time. He told me he had seen the credit card statements. He admitted it. He saw the charges for expensive restaurants, for stores he knew they couldn't afford. But every time he tried to ask, the performance would begin. Sienna would cry. She would tell him he didn't trust her. She would make him feel small and cruel for even questioning her. And he was a good man. My Marcus was a good man who couldn't stand to see a woman cry. So he would back down. He would apologize. He would let it go. And he would pay the bill. He was buying her love. I realized, no, that wasn't right. He wasn't buying her love. He was paying for the illusion of it. He was paying a monthly subscription to keep the loneliness away. I listened to it all. I didn't interrupt. I just let him pour out the years of doubt and shame and quiet complicity. When he finally finished, his coffee was cold. He looked exhausted. He looked like a little boy again, lost and waiting for his mother to tell him which way to go. But I knew I couldn't do that. I couldn't give him the answer. He had to find it himself. I looked at my son. His shoulders slumped in defeat. And I didn't say, "You have to leave her." I didn't say, "How could you let this happen?" Instead, I asked him something else. "Marcus," I said, my voice soft in the quiet diner, "do you remember when you were a little boy, you had that set of wooden blocks? The colorful ones." He looked up, a flicker of confusion in his tired eyes. He nodded. "You used to build towers," I went on. "Tall, magnificent towers, almost to the ceiling. But do you remember what would happen when you built them too fast? When you knew, deep down, that the bottom wasn't quite right, that the foundation wasn't steady?" He was quiet for a long moment. I could almost see the memory turning over in his mind. He looked down at his hands, resting on the tabletop, and then he answered. His voice was barely a whisper. "I'd knock it down," he said. "I'd knock the whole thing down myself, so I could start over and build it right." He said the words, and as soon as they left his mouth, he understood. He slowly lifted his head and looked at me, really looked at me. And for the first time all night, the fear in his eyes was gone. It was replaced by something else. Something small, but something solid. It was a flicker of resolve. He knew. His tower, this life he had built, was standing on a foundation of lies, and he was the only one who could decide to knock it down. The plan. 3 days passed. It was a strange kind of quiet that settled over those 3 days. Not a peaceful quiet, but a heavy one. The kind of quiet that comes after a fever breaks, when the body is weak but the mind is finally clear. I didn't call him. My hands hovered over the phone a dozen times, but I always pulled back. This was his silence to own. He needed to sit with the wreckage, to feel the sharp edges of the truth he had avoided for so long. He needed this quiet to find his own strength, not to borrow mine. On the 4th day, a Tuesday, I heard a key in my front door. It wasn't the sound of a visitor knocking. It was the familiar, scraping sound of his old key, the one I gave him the day he left for college. Tucked inside a worn copy of his favorite book, the sound of a son coming home. He looked different. When he walked in, he was thinner, maybe, or maybe he was just standing taller, without the invisible weight that had been stooping his shoulders for years. The storm was still in his eyes. I could see it, but it wasn't the swirling hurricane of confusion I had seen on the side of the road. No, this was the calm, gray, endless sky that comes after the storm has passed, leaving a stark and empty landscape behind. It was the look of a man who has surveyed the damage and is now, finally, ready to count the costs. He didn't waste a single word on small talk about the weather or my health. He walked past the living room, past the comfortable armchair where he used to sit, and went straight to my small kitchen table, the one where he used to spread out his homework as a boy, his brow furrowed in concentration. He pulled out a chair, the one that always wobbled just a little, and sat down. He placed both of his hands flat on the worn formica surface, palms down, as if to ground himself to something solid, something real. "I saw a lawyer, Mom," he said. His voice was steady. It was quiet, but it had a core of steel in it that I hadn't heard in a very long time. Just a consultation. I needed to understand my options. I needed to see what was mine, what was hers, and what was ever really ours. That last word, asterisk, ours asterisk, hung in the air with a new, profound sadness. It was a word that was supposed to mean strength and unity. For him, it had become a question mark. I just nodded. My body moved on its own, a mother's instinct taking over. My hands went about the familiar, comforting motions of making coffee, the scrape of the scoop in the coffee grounds, the gurgle of the water heating up. It was a ritual to keep them from trembling, to give them something to do, besides reaching out to smooth the worry from his brow like he was still 5 years old. I poured a cup for him. Black. The way he always liked it. Even though I had a feeling it would just grow cold in his hands. I went to the bank this morning, he continued, his eyes fixed on mine, holding my gaze with a new intensity. He wasn't looking away anymore. I opened a new account, a separate account. My paycheck direct deposit will start going there, effective immediately. I transferred just enough into the joint account to cover the mortgage and the utilities for this month. After that, he let the sentence drift. Unfinished. He didn't need to finish it. After that, the safety net was gone. I saw him so clearly in that moment. Not just my son, the boy I raised to be kind and trusting. I saw Marcus the engineer, the builder, the man who designs systems and understands structural integrity. For years, he had been trying to patch a collapsing building with emotional duct tape and financial glue, all the while knowing the foundation was rotten. Now, he was finally looking at the blueprint of his own life, seeing the fatal flaws, and calculating the necessity of a controlled demolition. What is the plan, son? I asked softly, setting the coffee cup on the table before him. He didn't even glance at it. He looked down at his hands, spread flat on the table. It's not enough that I know the truth, Mom. I think I need to see it in action. I need to see what she does when the lights go out. I need to know for sure, without a single shred of doubt. And then he told me the plan. It wasn't a plan born from anger. There was no fire of revenge in his voice. No desire to hurt her the way she had hurt him. It was cold. It was logical. It was a test. A simple, heartbreaking, and final test. I'm going home tonight, he said, his voice flat as a slab of concrete. And I'm going to tell her that my company is planning layoffs. A major corporate restructuring. I'm going to tell her that my job might be on the line. I'll say that for the next few months, maybe longer. Things are going to be uncertain. And then I'm going to say that we have to stop all non-essential spending immediately. No more dinners out. No more shopping. No new clothes. Nothing. We have to save every single penny. Starting right now. I understood instantly. This wasn't just another lie to counter her ocean of lies. This was a science experiment. He was creating a vacuum, a controlled environment, to observe the true nature of the woman he had married. A marriage vow is a promise. It's spoken in a warm church, full of flowers and hope. Asterisk. For better or for worse. For richer or for poorer. Asterisk. It's easy to say the words when times are good. He was about to find out what those words actually meant when the money was gone. Would she be the partner, the warrior, the woman who would immediately sit down with a notepad and start brainstorming ways to save? Who would wrap her arms around him and say, "It's okay. Your job doesn't define you. We have each other. And that's all that matters." The woman who would start looking for deals, clipping coupons, and offering to find more freelance work herself to help bridge the gap. Or would the mask of the loving, the supportive wife finally slip and shatter on the floor when the blank check was suddenly and indefinitely canceled? Would the man who signed it still have any value in her eyes? A cold fear, sharp and painful, washed over me. I was terrified of what he would discover. I was terrified of the answer he already knew deep in his heart but needed to see with his own 2 eyes. But underneath that fear, a fierce, burning pride bloomed in my chest. He wasn't the broken boy hiding on the side of the road anymore. He wasn't just reacting to her demands. He wasn't paying for a performance. He was taking back the script. He was becoming the author of his own story again. "I will be here," I told him, my voice thick with all the things I couldn't say. It was the only promise I could make, the only one that mattered. "Whatever you find, when it's over, I will be here." He did it that night. The phone call came much later than I expected, around 10 o'clock. He was whispering, and I could hear the faint, lonely sound of wind whistling in the background. It told me he was standing outside on their apartment balcony, hiding in the dark to talk to his own mother. "I told her," he said. His whisper was tight, unstrained, like a wire pulled taut. I laid it all out. The possible job loss, the uncertainty, the need to cut back on everything. I gripped my old telephone receiver, my knuckles aching. My whole body felt like one giant listening ear. What did she say? Marcus, what did she do? She was perfect. Mom, he said, and the words were hollow, completely empty of any relief. It was the most heartbreaking thing he could have said. She played the part perfectly. She gasped at exactly the right moment. She rushed over and held my hand. She told me not to worry. She said we were a team, that we were in this together, and that we would get through it, no matter what. She promised she would stand by me. He went quiet for a long moment. I could hear a siren wailing somewhere far away in the city, a sound of some distant emergency, while the real emergency was happening right here. In a whisper, over the phone, she promised, he repeated, and this time his voice was so soft. It was like a dying breath, the sound of a hope he didn't even know he was holding on to, finally extinguishing. But, I prompted gently, because the word was hanging between us, heavy and unspoken, a ghost in the machine. But, he finally said, the sound barely a vibration over the line. The whole time she was saying those beautiful things, the whole time she was holding my hand and looking at me with those concerned eyes, she never once looked times me. Not really. She looked at my forehead, at my chin, and her thumb, her other thumb. Mom, it was just rubbing back and forth, over the dark, blank screen of her phone, like she was soothing it, or getting it ready for a long journey. He didn't need to say anything else. I saw the image as clearly as if I were there in the dark with him. Her words were perfect. Her touch was perfect. Her performance was flawless. But her eyes were already looking for a way out. Her hands were already scrolling toward an escape route. Marcus told me she promised to stand by him. But a promise from a person who lives on lies is like a house built on sand. We had set the stage. The storm was coming. All we could do now was wait for the tide to come in. If this story is still touching you, please comment any number. Each number is a sign that I am not alone. The cracks appear. For 2 full weeks, my son became an actor. It was a role he was not born to play, but one he learned with a grim determination. He would come home from his real job, the one where he built worlds out of code, and step into his second one, the role of the worried husband. He performed it perfectly. He'd loosen his tie at the door and let out a heavy sigh. He'd rub the back of his neck at the dinner table, talking about restructuring and potential downsizing. He spoke of colleagues being let go, men with families. His voice laced with a carefully measured dose of anxiety. He was good. Perhaps he had been paying attention to Sienna's methods all those years, learning the craft of performance through osmosis. And just as the lawyer, a quiet woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, had predicted, the moment the steady river of his generosity seemed to be slowing to a trickle, the cracks in Sienna's own performance began to appear. They were subtle at first, the kinds of things a man in love, a man determined to believe, would never see. But my son, the boy who had spent years choosing blindness, was now watching with the focus of a hawk. His eyes, once clouded with a hopeful naivety, were now clear, and they missed nothing. He would call me late at night, after Sienna was asleep. His voice on the phone was never panicked. It was low, steady, and devoid of the frantic energy it once held. It was the voice of a scientist observing a chemical reaction, noting each change with a painful but necessary precision. It was the voice of a man confirming, piece by piece, a diagnosis he already knew in his heart to be true. The first piece of evidence arrived in a plain brown cardboard box. It wasn't a purchase from Amazon. It was a prepaid shipping kit from a website called The Real Real. Marcus had to look it up. It's a consignment site. Mom, he explained, his voice flat, a place where people sell their used luxury goods, handbags, shoes, things like that. That evening, he walked into their shared closet, the Michael Kors purse, the one she had proudly displayed on Instagram after he'd given me that gift of $200 for her supposed rent troubles, was gone. A few days later, the cream-colored cashmere shawl that had been draped so artfully over the dining chair was no longer there. Then, a pair of red-soled high heels. Shoes he'd only seen once, but whose price tag he had accidentally glimpsed, had vanished from their box on the top shelf. She was liquidating her assets, quietly, systematically. But when he logged into their joint bank account, the one they were supposed to be nurturing together through this difficult time, there were no new deposits, not a single dollar. The money from the purse, the shawl, the shoes, it was going somewhere else. A private account, a secret place he had no access to, a financial escape route. Then came the phone call. It was a Wednesday afternoon. Marcus was working from the small desk in their bedroom, the door slightly ajar. Sienna was in the living room, her voice a low, urgent murmur. She must have thought he had his headphones on for a work meeting, but he was sitting in perfect silence, listening to every carefully chosen word. It was her father, Leonard, on the other end of the line. Marcus couldn't hear his side of the conversation, but Sienna's words cut through the quiet apartment like shards of glass. "No. I told you, that's not an option anymore," she'd said, her voice a sharp, impatient hiss. He could picture her, pacing back and forth on their expensive rug, her hand gesturing in frustration. "The well is dry here. You understand. You have to find an alternative solution." There was a pause. Then she said the words that would echo in my son's mind for weeks. "Because the ship is sinking, Dad, and I am not going down with it. The ship is sinking." When Marcus told me those words later that night, my hand tightened on my own phone until my knuckles ached. A wave of fury washed over me, so hot and fierce it almost took my breath away. He was not a ship. He was my son. He was a good, kind man who had given everything. And she had just described him as a vessel to be abandoned in a storm. But beneath my anger was another feeling, a strange, cold, and painful pride. The boy who couldn't stand to see a woman cry, the man who would pay any price for a quiet life, was now sitting in a silent room, absorbing the full, brutal truth of his wife's betrayal. And he was not breaking. He was gathering it. He was collecting the truth like a weapon, the final pieces of the puzzle, the ones that left no room for interpretation or doubt, came from the place where all our modern secrets live, the computer. On the lawyer's advice, Marcus had installed a monitoring software on their shared desktop. "It's your property, Marcus," the lawyer had said, her voice pragmatic. "You have every right to know how it's being used." And what he found there, it was not just a crack. It was the complete and total demolition of the woman he thought he had married. He found the browser history. It read like a manual for a different life. Sienna had been spending hours on websites I'd never even heard of. Websites with slick, aspirational names. Seeking arrangement. Elite singles. What's your price? They weren't normal dating sites. Their taglines spoke of mutually beneficial relationships and connecting successful people. They were marketplaces. Marketplaces for a very specific type of transaction. And Marcus knew, with a sickening certainty, that he was about to be on the losing end of that deal. He found her LinkedIn profile, the professional networking site. She had quietly, meticulously, updated it. She had erased her last name. She was no longer Sienna Dubois, wife of Marcus Dubois. She was just Sienna Vance again, a single, unattached professional. She had edited his existence out of her public life, preparing her resume for her next merger. But the last crack, it wasn't a crack. It was a chasm. It was the email that finally swallowed the last of his hope whole. It was an email exchange with a property management company. Not in Baltimore. In another city, a city 3 states away. Known for its sunshine and its wealthy residents. Marcus sent me a screenshot of it. I had to put on my reading glasses, my old eyes struggling to focus on the small, black text on the glowing screen. It was a lease agreement, and attached to it was a receipt. A confirmation for a security deposit and the first month's rent. Paid in full, for a 1-bedroom luxury apartment with a view of the water. The move-in date was for the end of the month, less than 2 weeks away. She wasn't just thinking about leaving. She wasn't just planning an escape. She had already built the escape hatch. She had furnished it. She had paid for it. She was just waiting for the most convenient moment to climb through it and seal the door on her old life. On my son, forever. When I saw that, I leaned back in my armchair and closed my eyes. The anger was gone. The shock was gone. The sadness was a dull, distant ash. All I felt was a profound, weary stillness. There were no more questions to ask. There were no more truths to uncover. The performance was over. The evidence was collected. All that was left to do now was to bring down the final curtain. The final conversation. Marcus called me on a Thursday afternoon. The sky was that flat, gray color it gets in late autumn, threatening a rain that never comes. His voice on the phone was different. It had lost the frayed edges of the past few weeks. It was calm, resolute. "It's time." "Mom," he said. And it wasn't a question. "Can you come over tonight at 7? I arrived at 6:50. He let me in. And the first thing I noticed was the silence. The apartment, which always seemed to hum with some kind of nervous energy from Sienna music playing. The television on was completely still. The air was different, too. The usual scent of expensive floral diffusers was gone. It just smelled like a place. A clean, anonymous place. Like a hotel room between guests. He had set the stage. The large, polished wood dining table, usually adorned with a decorative runner and a vase of flowers, was bare. It looked like a boardroom table. He was sitting at the head of it, and in front of him, perfectly squared, was a neat stack of white papers. He had printed everything out. He stood up when I walked in. He looked older than he had a month ago. The last few weeks had carved new lines around his eyes. But they were lines of clarity, not of worry. They were the lines a person gets when they have finally stopped squinting and have opened their eyes to a harsh, bright light. He gave me a hug, and it wasn't the tentative hug of a lost little boy. It was the firm, sure embrace of a man. "Thank you for being here," he whispered into my ear. And the words were heavy with a history I didn't need him to explain. I just squeezed his arm and took my seat at the side of the table. I was not a participant. I was a witness. Sienna came home at 7:15. She swept into the room on a cloud of her expensive perfume, humming a cheerful little tune and carrying a paper bag from Whole Foods. When she saw me sitting there, a silent figure at her dining table, her humming stopped mid-note, a flicker of pure annoyance, quick as a camera shutter, crossed her face before she expertly smoothed it over with a bright, manufactured smile. "Adeline, what a surprise. I didn't know you were coming over. You should have told me. I would have gotten something special. Sit down." "Sienna," Marcus said. His voice wasn't angry. It was quiet, but it had a new density, a weight to it that made the air in the room feel heavy. It made her stop. Her eyes darted from his stone-like face to my impassive one. And then, finally, to the neat stack of white papers sitting on the table like an indictment. The smile vanished. The color seemed to drain from her face. She slowly placed her grocery bag on the kitchen counter and walked to the table. Pulling out the chair opposite him, she sat down, her back ramrod straight. Marcus didn't waste time with small talk. He didn't build up to a climax. He simply reached for the first piece of paper on the top of the stack. It was a credit card statement from 2 months ago, the one from their trip to Napa. He slid it across the polished surface of the table. It glided silently and came to a stop directly in front of her. "Can you explain this, Sienna?" he asked. His voice was a monotone. Her eyes, quick and sharp, darted over the columns of charges. The hotel, the vineyard tours, the expensive restaurants. She looked up, and the first act of her performance began. Her face became a mask of wounded innocence. "Marcus, what is this? Is this what this is about? You're checking up on me." "Those were business expenses. Potential clients. I told you I was networking. I was going to pay you back as soon as the invoice cleared." Marcus just looked at her. He didn't blink. He didn't argue the point. He let her lie, hang in the silent room. Then, he reached for the next set of papers. They were the screenshots from the Real and Poshmark, the sale of the Michael Kors purse, the sale of the cashmere shawl. He slid them across the table. "And this?" he asked, his voice still perfectly level. "Was this networking, too?" Sienna's face began to crumble. This was an unexpected prop. The performance was failing. I was trying to help," she stammered, her voice beginning to rise, gaining a hysterical edge. "You told me we were in trouble. I was selling my precious things to help us survive, and this is the thanks I get, you and your mother ganging up on me." Her eyes, now glistening with tears, shot toward me. The accusation was venomous. "This is your fault," she spat. a finger trembling as she pointed at me. "You've been trying to poison him against me from the very beginning." I did not move. I did not speak. I just held her gaze until she looked away. This was my son's stage now. Marcus let her finish. He waited patiently until her manufactured sobs subsided into sniffles. He waited for her to wipe her eyes and look at him, expecting him to melt, to apologize, like all the other times. But this time, he didn't. He reached for the last piece of paper, the final exhibit. It was the printout of the email, the one confirming the lease agreement for the luxury apartment 3 states away. He slid it across the table. It came to a stop right in front of her, on top of the other lies. "Explain this one." "Sienna," he said. She looked down at the paper. Her eyes scanned the familiar text. She saw the address in a city they had never talked about visiting. She saw the move-in date. Now, just a week away. She saw the bold letters confirming her security deposit. Paid. In full. The tears stopped. It was like a switch had been flipped. The faucet of her emotions was turned off. All the drama. All the hurt. All the frantic performance. It just evaporated into the still air of the room. She sat back in her chair, her spine straightening. The mask didn't just crack, it fell away completely. The play was over. She slowly lifted her head. The woman looking at my son was a complete stranger to me. To him, her face was cold, hard, chiseled from something that looked like indifference. There was no remorse in her eyes. There was no sadness. There was only the flat, empty look of annoyance. The look of a gambler whose bluff has been called. So what she said, and her voice was a flat, empty thing, stripped of all its musical charm. "You were sinking. I'm not going to sink with you. It's called survival." Survival. The word hung in the air, ugly and final. Marcus looked at her for a long, silent moment. He wasn't looking at the woman he loved anymore. He was looking at the truth. He had spent years avoiding it, paying to keep it hidden. But here it was, sitting at his table, looking back at him with cold, dead eyes. He nodded slowly. It was not a nod of agreement. It was a nod of understanding. A final, quiet acceptance. The job was never in danger. "Sienna," he said, and his voice was the calmest I had ever heard it in his life. "But our marriage is—" He stood up from the table. He pushed his chair in, the legs making a soft, scraping sound on the wood floor. It was the only sound in the room. He looked at me, his eyes clear for the first time in years. "Let's go, Mom." And together, we turned and walked out of the apartment. We left her sitting there, alone at the head of her empty, polished table, with nothing but a stack of white paper that told the true story of their life together. We didn't run. We didn't storm out. We just walked. We walked out the door, and we didn't look back. The quiet dawned. It's been 6 months now. The divorce papers were signed on a Tuesday. A day just like any other. There was no thunder, no dramatic exit. Her performance had ended, and she simply left the stage, taking the expensive props with her. The quiet that followed was clean. It was the kind of silence that fills a house after a long, painful fever has finally broken. I'm sitting in my armchair, the one by the window. The sun is just starting to bleed over the horizon, painting the edges of the clouds in shades of soft pink and gray. This is my favorite time of day, a time for quiet thinking. My coffee is warm in my hands. It's just coffee, not a tool to stay awake through a long night of worry. Just coffee. Marcus is doing okay. He's more than okay. He's rebuilding. He sees a therapist every Thursday. A nice woman, he says, who is helping him look at the blueprints of his own heart, helping him understand the parts of himself that made him so afraid to be alone. He comes over for dinner every Sunday now, not out of duty, but because he wants to. We don't talk much about what happened. We don't have to. It's in the way he looks at me now, with an honesty that had been missing for years. It's in the easy way we sit in silence. A comfortable silence now, not a heavy one. Last week, he was helping me fix a leaky faucet in my kitchen. He was on his back, half under the sink, surrounded by tools. He looked up at me, his face smudged with a bit of grease. He looked like the little boy who used to take apart my clocks just to see how they worked. "You know, Mom," he said, his voice echoing slightly from under the cabinet. For the longest time, I was angry. At her, at myself, but I'm starting to see it differently now. I waited. I learned something, he continued, his voice clear and sure. Asterisk. Asterisk. My mistake wasn't being kind. My mistake was thinking my kindness could change someone who didn't want to be changed. I have to be a better guardian of my own heart. A better guardian of his own heart. I let those words sink in. He wasn't broken. He was stronger. He had taken the wreckage of his marriage and started building a new foundation. A foundation made of self-respect. As for me, I've learned a thing or two as well. A mother's love is a fierce and complicated thing. For years, I thought my job was to build a safe, soft world for my son, to shield him from all the sharp edges. I was wrong. Asterisk, asterisk. I learned that a parent's greatest challenge isn't to protect their children from the world, but to give them the strength to face the truths they find in it. My job wasn't to fight Marcus's battle for him. It was to hold the lamp high so he could see the battlefield for himself. Asterisk, asterisk. And I had to be strong enough to let him walk onto it alone, knowing he might get hurt, but trusting that he would find his own way through. The sun is higher now. A warm sliver of light on my floor. It's a beautiful morning. The world keeps turning. People fall in love. People fall out of love. But something has shifted, not just for us, but in the way I see the world. In this world of filters and carefully curated images, we've become experts at performing happiness. Sienna wasn't just a liar, she was a product of her time. A time that values the appearance of success more than the quiet integrity of character. Asterisk, asterisk. She built a beautiful stage set, and she just needed someone to finance the production. And my son, my good, kind son, he was a willing audience. Because the performance was so much easier to watch than the empty stage of his own fear. It's easier to believe in a beautiful lie than to face an ugly truth about yourself. Especially the truth that you are afraid. I take a sip of my coffee. It's warm. It's real. I think, in the end, that's all we can ever hope for. The hardest, most courageous thing we can do, I think, is to finally turn off the show. To sit in the quiet darkness of our own lives, with all our flaws and all our fears, and learn to be okay with who we are when no one is watching. To be a better guardian of our own heart. The sun is fully up now. It's going to be a good day. I can feel it. And so, the story of what I heard and what I saw comes to a close. But the feelings, I know, linger on. What do you think of the path Marcus finally chose, and of my decision to hold up that lamp for him if you were in my shoes? Or in his? Would you have done anything differently? Please, share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I find a piece of my own story in yours. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think or feel something true, please don't forget to leave a like, share it with someone you believe it will touch, and, of course, subscribe to Duplicator Stories and turn on notifications, so you don't miss the next mystery we unravel together. I'll meet you in the next story. And who knows, next time, maybe it will be you who sees something no one else does.